friends at Chatham House, where we've been convening on these big issues in international relations and conflict for over 100 years now. So thank you very much for joining us tonight to help us to continue that tradition. And indeed, this is almost a new tradition in that, to have this annual meeting on the 10 conflicts to watch that Crisis Group produces every year. My name is Patricia Lewis. I'm the Research Director for Conflict Science Transformation and the Director of International Security. And I'm delighted to welcome you back to Chatham House, Dr Comfort Ero, who's the President and CEO of Crisis Group, but the first time doing this particular new tradition. So before we begin, a few important points. One is that the discussion is on the record and it's being live streamed. So welcome everyone to the live stream. I've got a laptop here where I can see questions, and for those who do want to ask questions individually, please let me know that. That would be very helpful. Or if you want me to read them out, let me know that as well. And for those who want to, we do encourage you to tweet, and please use the hashtag #CHEvents, and if you can, at Chatham House, give us a little bit of a shout out, that would be helpful. So this is a highly anticipated report every year at Chatham House, I think. The 10 conflicts to watch, which is published by Crisis Group. And there's no better person for this than Dr Comfort Ero, who is the President and CEO of Crisis Group, and who spent her entire career working on or in conflict-affected countries. And Comfort, you've been in post now for a year,
yes.
Right? But you first joined Crisis Group in 2001, and you've had a long association with Crisis Group. You've also served as Deputy Africa Programme Director for the International Centre for Transitional Justice, and you've been Political Affairs Officer and Policy Advisor to the Special Representative, the Secretary General at the UN Mission in Liberia. And of course, you have a PhD from our very close neighbours, the LSE.
Thank you.
You know, we've known each other for, I don't want to talk about how long, but it's a great pleasure to have you in this capacity back at Chatham House. So
Thank you
really
very much.
Warm welcome. And I'm going to start by asking you some questions and get into a conversation, and then we're going to open up to the floor, because you will all think I've done a completely inadequate job of asking the questions, so I'm sure you'll have some great ones to ask. So I thought we'd start by you telling us about this year's 10 conflicts to watch. You know, how have we come up with this particular list? What's the methodology behind it? And how does it compare and contrast with last year's list? What's missing? What's gone up the agenda? And how did last year's list pan out in terms of how good were your predictions? I mean, Ukraine, yes, absolutely. So we'll give you that. But what about the rest?
Thank you very much. And really, it's a pleasure to be back here, but this time as capacity leading Crisis Group. And also thank you to Chatham House for continuing the partnership where we launched the 10 conflicts to watch over here. And it's really nice to see some familiar faces, Leslie particularly, our good friends here in the front as well. Let me start by explaining the methodology, because that really never necessarily changes. And then I can do the compare and contrast and publicly hold ourselves to account on how well our assessments from last year panned out as well. I mean, there's no science behind it. It's really a judgment that we take with our experts, our analysts throughout the regions where we work, and we look right across the board, right across the various regions to get a sense of the various changing dynamics of the evolution of certain conflicts. What is definitely at the top and never changes for Crisis Group, given our mandate, is that it's really about the number of people suffering, dying, the humanitarian imperative behind a number of these conflicts. And when you look at the figures by the UN itself, by the Office for Humanitarian Affairs, you begin to understand why it's not a surprise that some of the conflicts that we put on our list are there, just because of the sheer humanitarian and human toll, and that's increasing, not decreasing, as we continue this, sadly, continue this watch list as well. But beyond that important dynamics, there are, I think, when we look across the board and when we speak to our analysts in the various regions, whether it's Latin America or the Middle East region or Asia or Africa or Europe as well, there are at least three things that sort of that explain why we've got the 10, but also why we had the 10 of last year. The geopolitical significance is right at the top. And it also explains why twice in a row Ukraine is at the top, because the fallout and the ramifications and the geopolitical significance of Ukraine. But it's not just Ukraine that has that geopolitical significance, whether it's Yemen, it's Iran, it's the Great Lakes region where you've seen a proxy war playing out. That explains why those countries are featured in our 10 conflicts this year. I think the other significance is where we see opportunities for peacemaking, where we see opportunities to drive through or find a pathway to peace. So explains why Ethiopia was on our list last year and this year. Different positions, but nonetheless it's on the list last year. And it's also why Yemen also was on the list. What binds those two countries together was that there was a truce last year, both of them broke down. Now we have opportunities again for peace in Ethiopia, and a great deal of question marks over that, and we can talk about that later as well. The other reason or the other methodology that drives our conflicts is also just the change in dynamics on the ground, ever flowing in, sometimes in the wrong direction. Explains why Haiti is on the list as well. Sometimes going in the right direction, but oftentimes we see just a deteriorating circumstances as well. Also explains why we've put Taiwan on the list, because we're warning about something into the future. Even if we don't see the near and present danger today, there are trend lines that are very disturbing, particularly around major power tensions that then means certain conflicts are intensified. Now to what we said last year and how I don't know if I'm the best person to judge. I'm looking at the list now from last year as well. I think the very first thing to say, Patricia, is that even if it's not on the list this year, and even if it's on the list last year, it doesn't mean that conflict is still not of concern. I think at the end, what drives our analysis is that we're saying to you that we're not saying that this is an inclusive list or this is an exhaustive list, but we are saying that this is the 10 conflicts that our experts believe that you should be paying attention to this year. That doesn't mean that because Israel-Palestine is not on the list this year that the troubles over there are no longer important. They are. It also is just a sad reality that there's so much to choose from today, that there's just that the international peace and security landscape is going in the wrong direction. Now we have a war in Europe, the ramifications of that as well. So this is not a good moment to be talking. And even though these are 10 conflicts, they are simply what we believe you should be watching, but it doesn't mean that all the other concerns are off the table. It's also conflicts that we believe that are sometimes below the radar, that we try to bring back onto the radar of international attention. And also, as I said, ones that we think requires concerted international action. The one conflict that a number of people last year, a number of people asked us why we didn't put North Korea on the list. This year, I've noticed, just by looking across what's coming through on the social media, a number of people have asked us, why didn't you put Myanmar on the list? And there are good reasons why we should have included Myanmar, but we also needed to think about other conflicts in the Asia region that are of concern to us, and Pakistan therefore was put on the list, partly because of the political tensions in the country, but also just the dire consequences coming from the tremendous flood that took place in the country and the economic woes that accompany that as well. So I'll be quite interested to hear people's perspectives, but that explains what's on the list last year and what's not on the list. My final point about the comparison with last year and this year is Ukraine. Sadly, crisis group, one doesn't want to boast about tragedies, but we were very clear last year that take Putin at his word. He wasn't bluffing, that there would be some kind of military adventurism, the scale of it, the depth of it, how long it would last, nobody could predict. I mean, some thought it would be a quick victory, but we were very clear that there would be some kind of military adventurism from Putin, and the groundwork had already been laid in the years leading into that as well.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. I think many of us were very worried a year ago. It was clearly hotting up. But I think the global ramifications of it, for example, and this is one of the key things about Russia's war against Ukraine, which I find, we didn't really fully understand. Obviously, there were all the sanctions, which, were really important, but have all sorts of global ramifications. There's the issue of resources, there's the issue of energy prices, food. So, I was recently in Central America and became aware of how far away Europe felt to me. And I think that's very true for many countries around the world, even though it's having direct impact on them. So how do you think the rest of the world understands these global ramifications, and will that change the way in which other countries that are far away, we often ignore faraway conflicts here, right?
Yeah.
And it's quite understandable that they would also not feel connected to a conflict in Europe. But given the global ramifications, how will that change and shift over time?
Yeah, in fact, I think one of the most sort of glaring factors that emerged that has emerged so far out of Ukraine is just the extent of that ramifications, and that there are different ways in which you can look at it. I mean, what you're pointing to is how the rest of the world outside of Europe has viewed it, whether it's in Latin America or Asia or Africa, and there's been a tendency to sort of lump a number of countries together under the global south and speak of the global south as having one voice. And then a number of people have talked about a non-aligned redux. A number of people have talked about a return to Cold War politics. A number of people have spoken about the West versus the rest. And I think what is very clear is that the way in which the West wants the rest of the world to view the Ukraine hasn't panned out in the same way. What I've been very clear about, at least when speaking about it, from the so-called, and I say so-called global south because we haven't found another way in which to explain it, although I think we should just talk about the regions in themselves. When I've been asked to think about it, at least from the Africa context, I've pushed back against some notion or some assumption that somehow a number of countries or the continent itself doesn't understand what is going on in Ukraine. So there is an understanding that this is aggression. There is an understanding that this is an invasion, that this is a threat to the political integrity, there's the sovereignty of another nation, and that those principles that are embedded in the United Nations Charter are not up for grabs. That none of these countries who may have a different view about what Ukraine means, they are not contesting these principles of political independence, of sovereignty, of territorial integrity. What, however, they are discussing, however, is about the double standards and about the hypocrisy. Some of them are also challenging this notion that why is it that you are insisting that we have to support you, what some of them see as a war between the West and Russia? Why are you insisting that we have to back that war? You never took the same sort of consideration for our conflict as well. When some people say, for example, that Mariupol, for example, is our Aleppo, it's not a surprise that you hear some of the countries in the Gulf countries turn around and say Aleppo is our Aleppo. This is our crisis. When you ask us to pick and choose, we say, well, why are you forcing us to take sides? We don't see this as a need for us to take choices. We have our relationships. We want to safeguard those relationships as well. The other thing is that Ukraine is coming in the context of a period where there was a lack of solidarity, lack of international cooperation, for example, over the global pandemic, COVID-19, and you saw the fallout from the vaccine diplomacy. Also, at the same time, this is coming at a time when a number of countries are asking for support over climate financing. So you insist that we support you, but when we ask for your support, you weren't backing us. So that, and you've seen a lot of frustration, a lot of irritation by a number of countries that are outside of Europe as well. So, and I really do want to emphasize, it's not that a number of these countries do not see what is happening against Ukraine. They understand it as aggression. What they don't want is that you force them to pick and choose sides. And what they also want you to understand is that we also have national security interest. We also have foreign policy interest, and we're going to be guided by that and not by what you define those interests to be as well. And I think that's been an interesting, it's been interesting to watch that. But it's also been interesting to watch a number of countries feel emboldened as well to actually stare down the West and say, we want you to understand our own perspective on these issues. And then you've seen a rise of a number of countries, sort of middle powers, activists who feel that they too sort of have a position and that they want to also assert their own foreign policy independence.
Like Turkey, for example.
Like Turkey. Yeah. Turkey, interestingly, I would put that in I'd put it in the camp of sort of middle powers, very activists in its own position, played a very assertive role in terms of diplomacy in Africa, for example, has been trying to strike a balance between its position in NATO, its relationship with Russia, being one of the outside powers with Russia in Syria, but also playing a very important role in terms of the Black Sea grain deal as well. So it's you know, that's one of the rising middle powers, and watching how it's asserted its own foreign policy, even on the question of Finland and Sweden coming into NATO, and how it sort of was very vocal in terms of its own demands vis-a-vis the entry of those two countries into NATO.
Yes,
well.
exactly. No, I think that's been really one of the key things. And, you know, we're looking at also China and what China's learning. Mm-hmm. So China's been very interesting in response to this conflict. Obviously, it's looking at the disruption that Russia is causing. It has a traditional relationship, but has been quite irritated, I think, by Russia, and particularly the threat to use nuclear weapons, right? Which has put China in a difficult position, India as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, China's been, it's been actually interesting to watch and trying to assess how Xi Jinping and the rest of China has viewed Russia's invasion into Ukraine. You'll recall that, you know, ahead of the Olympics, Putin and Xi Jinping met. Who knows what he whispered into Xi Jinping's ear about how quickly he thought he could go into Ukraine and do this in a very quick way. Certainly, I think this has become a headache for Xi Jinping. Certainly, it's a mess that he doesn't want to see. Having said that, and what we emphasize in the 10 conflicts is that despite, you know, his frustration or irritation or dissatisfaction in the way in which Putin has handled the crisis, he's not going to publicly undercut Putin and his war in Ukraine. He's also not going to compel or force Russia into any form of negotiated settlement. He's not going to make life easier for the West, for example. But at the same time, our sense is that, you know, Beijing is also not going to want to provoke the West any further. And it's also interesting that both him and both Xi Jinping and Chancellor Scholz were very clear on the question of the use of nuclear weapons. I think that really did make Beijing very nervous as well. You know, and I think there are other sort of ramifications for China when it looks also in its own neighborhood as well, you know, and other sort of geopolitical ramifications tied to Taiwan, for example. You know, a number of people have looked, therefore, at how China would deal with Taiwan because of in the context of Ukraine. You know, so question marks about the heavy price that Xi Jinping and China would pay should it therefore mount some kind of escalation on Taiwan. It's seen the impact of the sanctions that the West has imposed, very maximalist as well.
Presumably taking steps to protect itself in the longer run.
Taking steps to protect itself, not giving up on Taiwan, but necessarily taking those steps to protect itself, but very nervous so far about what it's seen in Russia. And you made reference to India, another one of those countries that we would put in that sort of middle power activist country, but another one of those countries that the West, in a sense, privately been dissatisfied that, India sort of kept that relationship pragmatically with Russia in terms of arms. But at the same time, India is an important ally vis-a-vis, against China as well. So the West may be sort of wanting India to sort of be in its own camp, and it's certainly there in terms of security and a close ally to the US in terms of security, but at the same time, India striking a very delicate balance, and also at the same time calling out Putin and talking about the danger of war at the same time. So again, it's that pragmatism that a number of these middle powers play according to their own national security interest and what makes sense for their own domestic and national impulses as well.
Well, maybe we could move and to look at Ethiopia. You mentioned Ethiopia and Tigray earlier, and you've been flagging this for quite some time, and we've seen a lot of movement over the last year in terms of attempts at brokering peace. How do you see the potential for the whole peace process in Ethiopia and Tigray? Because the original attack, although there'd always been this tension and this dispute, but nonetheless, given the Nobel Prize, etc., there was all this optimism about that, and then it was similar shock in a way to Russia's invasion of Ukraine to a lot of people. So how do you see the future of that going forward? And of course, the real importance of Ethiopia in Africa and for the rest of the world.
Yeah. One of the things I did last year, and I noticed he came into the room, Nick Westcott asked us a year ago sort of a similar question when the Royal African Society was having its own debate on the question of Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is a country that was both on our watch list last year and this year, and it's in the last 5 years been a constant priority for Crisis Group. I think the very first thing to say, and it speaks again to the methodology that Crisis Group uses to guide the 10 conflicts, is that from a humanitarian perspective, in terms of the suffering and the violence, this is an important good news. Because what has accompanied the peace, even if it's fragile, at the moment, what has accompanied the peace is that it's led to an opening of access into Tigray. Astonishing, devastating violence, sexual violence, devastation of infrastructure, starvation, the return, if you remember, Patricia, in the 80s was dominated by famine, and the idea that we were talking about famine again at a time when people were celebrating the birth of democracy or democratization in Ethiopia has been quite devastating.
There was a terrible Ethiopian Eritrean.
Exactly. So I think that we should note that that's an important news. Now, as to the future and the viability of the peace process, I mean, I don't want to say it hangs in the balance, but there are a number of unresolved questions and a number of unresolved issues. We were very concerned when the peace, part one of the peace deal, I think it's safe to call it, was signed in Pretoria. Huge sigh of relief, but there was a sense in which it was a victor's peace, a victor's, outcome for Prime Minister Abiy. The balancing of that initial settlement came in Nairobi when there was further talks, and then, what was put on the table then was that, Eritrea would withdraw from from Tigray and Amhara, the region within Ethiopia, would also pull back. And there are question marks about, whether the Tigrayans themselves will disarm and how serious Prime Minister Isaias would be about withdrawing from northern Tigray as well. So there are a number of question marks also just about the sustainability also and the commitment of both sides in the conflict as well. So I think here it's really key and imperative that those who are guarantors to the peace, particularly African leaders, continue to pressure both sides, those who have direct access to both Prime Minister Abiy but the Tigrayan leaders. It's also important that we make sure that the humanitarian corridor is left open. It's good that there's now some domestic flights going into Tigray, but we're not out of the woods yet. Last year we had a truce that quickly turned into a war. And now, I think the big question mark now is whether, Isaias can be trusted to pull back, whether the Tigrayans will disarm, and whether Addis as well will keep faithfully committed to Pretoria and the Nairobi peace deal as well.
Crisis Group have people all over the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the most interesting things about the way in which you work. You have people really plugged in, working on the ground, feeding back information that allows you to do this type of analysis. And so are there any other conflicts that you want to highlight? We can get into some more specifics, I guess, from the questions. But are there any ones that you want to highlight, either in Africa or in other parts of the world, that's on this 10 conflicts to watch before we go to the floor?
Thanks for asking. The other one, in the time that I've been at Crisis Group, and much of that was as Africa Programme Director, of all the conflicts that was that has focused on Crisis Group was always the Democratic Republic of Congo. It has never, I was trying to see if it ever appeared on any of our watch lists, and I don't recall it appearing on the watch list, and this is the first time it has appeared. And if you recall, at the beginning, when you asked me about the methodology and what guides us, it said one of the key things that guides our decision is the geopolitical ramifications of any particular conflict. And here, it's not just the DRC, but it's the Great Lakes. And that region is back on the table for us in a very significant way. We are talking at a time where the country is on the eve of elections this year, where we're seeing the resurgence of the M23 former sort of ex-Congolese army soldiers, mainly Tutsis, where the UN has reported that Rwanda continues to support this insurgency, where Felix Tshisekedi, the president of Congo, is trying to reassert authority in the east and has brought in and welcomed Uganda and Burundi, and out of frustration, Rwanda sees this as a threat, both economically, politically, and from a security perspective. So we're watching the unfolding of a proxy war, and the region has decided to launch a regional force to intervene, to compel the insurgency. And this is a region that has already got a UN peacekeeping mission, and the UN peacekeeping mission is struggling in terms of how to manage the crisis. So it's one to watch, a very worrying one, because it sucks in 3 countries. Kenya also, following its own elections, finding itself having to both manage its own internal problems and deal with a regional consideration. So that's one that I would want to sort of emphasize. And then because we're talking about peacekeeping, the other one to talk about is Haiti. And the reason I mention it is it was on our list last year, and it's on our list this year. And it's a country that has really had a very difficult relationship with sort of the international community, with the UN particularly, and yet it's a country now that is turning back to the international community to ask for some kind of foreign force to help it compel gangs that are now, who have got a strong foothold controlling much of the country, and that really puts that country in a very dire situation as well. So I really wanted to flag that. And the other thing that I think is important sort of to emphasize, Patricia, and it runs right through the 10 conflicts, and hopefully we can discuss it further with the audience, is that despite the difficulties and the very worrying trends that we're seeing internationally, multilateralism hasn't completely died.
No, and in fact, I think there's a reinvestment.
There's been, and how ironic, you know, that a number of people are now defending multilateralism. You know, last year or the year before, you know, under the previous Trump regime, there was a backlash, you know, and we talked a lot about how dysfunctional the Security Council is, and yet we've seen in the last year or so that although, you know, there's been struggles and the dysfunction is still there in the Security Council, it's managed to compartmentalize, you know, a number of issues, and it's managed to, the machinery is still working, and out of it you saw a very activist UN Secretary General deliver the Black Sea grain deal and other things that were very important, whether in terms of climate security or even in Ukraine. So it's not all been bad and gloomy. There's still some things that are working, though we can talk about the quality of the institutions.
And as Bronwyn pointed out last night, the General Assembly has had a new lease of life as well.
A new lease of life, you know, 3 times I think they went to the Security Council. In fact, you know, I took the opportunity to listen to Bronwyn this morning because I knew I was coming here.
Good,
and one thing I welcomed that she said was that it was important that if you wanted to ensure the legitimacy of these institutions going forward, that you made sure that it was more representative, you know, and her recognising the importance of the African Union to be part of the G20, and it's going to be a very significant year with India also being at the helm of the G20, and then you've got Japan also at the helm of the G7, and how that's going to be very important in terms of reviving the relevance of these various multilateral bodies as well.
So before we turn to the floor, and we've got a number of questions online, there's one question that's come up online, and just answer it very quickly. Are the conflicts themselves arranged in order in the report? No.
No, but
number one is Russia,
number
Ukraine.
One is Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, so, and I said, because it encapsulates all those things that I said, the geopolitical ramifications. The one that we haven't talked about, and it may come up, is about the nuclear risks and escalation associated with that as well. But it's not in a ranking order.
Don't get me started on that.
No.
But and Nawaz was asking that, and I think I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
So it's number one, and then the rest are pretty well in the top 10.
You can guarantee that the first one is the one that's at the top of our concerns.
Great. Right, so well, you see, this is the thing about this thing. We always get so many great questions. I'm really looking forward to this. So I'm going to the front row, please, with the woman there. Please introduce yourselves and use the microphone because we have people online who need to hear. So it's not enough that people in the room can hear you. So please say who you are.
First of all, thank you so much. I am Thea Tutberidze. I'm a PhD student at King's College War Studies Department. My question is before question, I just want to say one thing. This war in Ukraine, I hope, wakes the West. And I really hope it changes many things, because many conflicts, what we have seen, even in Europe, have been supported by Russia, Yugoslavia, Georgia, and so on and so forth. My question is about, do you think there is any possibility of peace process in any direction without defeat Russia in Ukraine? Politically and militarily. Thank you.
So, Comfort, do you want to take that? Because I think it's a really important question to answer. Why don't you take that at the beginning? I'll go back to the floor. And if people just keep their hands up, I will ignore you. Just to let you know that. Please put them up and down so that I can see at the time. Thank you.
Do you want
Please.
me? Do you want me to?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good question. Very difficult one for an organisation that, you know, always looks for a pathway to peace. One would hope that there will be a settlement that also includes Russia not defeating Russia. You know, I think a Putin, Russia that's got his back to the wall, that feels imperiled, that sees no way out, is a dangerous Putin, is a dangerous Russia. So I would hope there would be some kind of settlement. What that looks like, we can't go ahead of Ukraine in terms of what that looks like. I mean, I think Ukraine has been very clear on its demands, but also Russia has been very clear on demands. I think the worst case scenario is one that leads to some kind of victory. You want a situation where the territorial integrity of Ukraine remains sacrosanct as well, but you also want a situation where you don't force the hardliners around Putin and those around him to feel impelled to push harder.
Can I challenge you a little bit on that? Because I think it's so important. So, in other words, essentially, the more dangerously and crazily someone might behave, the more then we worry about them and give in to them. And does that make others do the same?
Yeah, and that's exactly that.
You're not saying that.
Absolutely not saying that as well. And I think that's been one of the calculations that we've been looking at very, very carefully as well. And you know, the question that we've always looked at is what is the risk of a nuclear escalation? And you know, Putin has been very astute at using that and dangling that in front of Ukraine and in front of the West. And the West hasn't shifted its own position. The West hasn't changed its tactics. The West has continued. And Crisis Group, for an organization that's about conflict prevention, that is always looking for a way out, we've been very clear about the use of and the appropriate use of and supporting and providing those military weapons to Ukraine. We've also been clear about not going ahead of Ukraine in terms of what a political settlement looks like. But at the back of everybody's consideration is making sure that you can, as far as possible, keep Putin in the room and keep Russia in the room. I think there are 4 hard questions that we need to address, and I see you're nodding your head. Yeah. No, right now it doesn't work.
It's not working, and it will not work if you know well Russia.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'll take one more from the floor here, and then, oh gosh, it's so difficult. I'm going to go to the back, I think, just because I went to the front. So the woman at the back, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna Joy Rickard from the Tony Blair Institute. I focus on the Sahel, but I'm interested in looking at conflicts across the globe. And there's an interesting dynamic I find where geopolitics is changing, the world is changing, and ties between countries are changing. And yet, when you look at a particular conflict, you'll see, as you're rightly emphasising, you have the country leading that, the regional response to it, and then you have international actors, particularly the West, interacting with those conflicts. And often that is based on historical ties. So in the UK, even in this room, although it's very international, in the UK there'll be a lot more familiarity with certain conflicts that you're talking about rather than other ones. And I'm interested in, how do you see that as Western actors look at conflicts around the world? Do you encourage those historical ties where it's understood? Do you think there should be shifting and changing as geopolitics changes? I'm interested in your thoughts around this.
And then I've got another question from online who I'm not sure if Kieran O'Mara, if you want to speak, or whether you're happy for me to read it out. So I'm not sure how quickly that can be done. I'll read one more before we decide that. Oh, he can't speak. Okay, so Kieran, I'll ask your question for you. So can this, to what extent is contemporary international order threatened by conflict, driven by ecological climate crisis? Climate and human security have featured heavily over the course of the past few reports. And can you speak a little bit to this notion in relation to the conflicts to watch in 2023? Thank you. And then I'd also like, if I can, to go to Mary Caldwell's question, if she wants to speak later, and to Mariano Aguirre, who's online. If both of them can be prepared to speak, that would be great. It's great to have you in to speak if possible. So, and of course, I'm sure you'd always want to take a question from both of those people.
Yeah,
So.
no, that's great. Yeah, and to the very question at
Yes,
the,
please. Thank you.
at the back. I mean, it's not, you know, when I look at certain conflicts across the world, you know, in Sierra Leone, the UK was the lead actor. And one of the things that Crisis Group said back in 2020, that, you know, the US should step into Liberia because of its own historical ties there, because France also was involved in Ivory Coast. So often, and this was in terms of the seesaw, and you wanting a lead nation and oftentimes those lead nations do have the historical ties that you were alluding to. I wasn't sure whether you were inferring that sometimes those former colonial powers then become problematic actors in terms of what we're seeing in the Sahel. I wasn't quite sure otherwise what the question was that you were trying to ask, but it's not a surprise that you see former colonial powers are the ones that are actually at the forefront of conflict prevention, resolution, or part of the problem, as we've seen also in the Sahel, and I can extend that to other regions as well, but because you specifically mentioned the Sahel.
Yeah. No, nobody can hear you online if you don't take the microphone. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, it's a question, for example, as the UK looks at various conflicts around the world, as geopolitics shifts and changes, but a government only has a certain amount of bandwidth and resources. So are we encouraging a country like the UK to keep looking at the evolving conflicts, or does it need to choose? How does a country prioritise?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. How does a country prioritise, especially when that country is also just, you know, hobbled with so much domestic problems as well, you know, which is what's happening in the UK, and I'll stop there. And many other countries as well. So I'll stop there because I may go down the wrong.
So part of that narrative, of course, is climate change, where the UK has been taking quite a lead.
And to be fair as well, although we got a little bit nervous in terms of was he going or was he not going to COP27 and all the unnecessary politics about there and about that as well. So the UK has played an important role, and I hope it continues to play that role. I mean, so climate change, for the first time under my predecessor, Rob Marley, was put as a conflict watch, and I think you led the conversation then as well. And it continues to be what I would consider, to borrow Nick's Westcott's line when we were briefing the UK, you know, Nick talked about one of the most significant mega trends that we needed to keep an eye on, certainly at least in relation to Africa, was climate change and climate security. The other mega trend being the COVID pandemic as well. I mean, we're not saying there's a direct causal link between climate change and climate security, but what we are seeing is that in a number of fragile countries, but also globally, this is not necessarily specific to countries that are at conflicts already, but we're seeing changing weather patterns and how that's also impacted, and that's even in America or Europe. We're seeing floods and droughts, you know, Pakistan, very devastating. And we're seeing countries that are fragile, that are vulnerable, not having the resources, the capacity to manage the consequences as a result of climate change. We're also seeing, you know, one of the drivers of conflict, for example, in the Sahel, particularly also in Nigeria, the herder-farmer crisis is also about sharing land and sharing resources and how a country manages those resources. We're also seeing a very devastating situation today in South Sudan, where a flood in one part of the country forces people to move to another part of the country. Which part of the country they move into? A region that's already affected by and is already in the midst of fighting as well. So it's why we have made a very big push for actors to begin to understand the link between climate security and fragility as well. And then was there another question? Is that Mary's
we're going
question?
on to I hope hear from Mary Caldwell and Mariano Aguirre. So I'm hoping that they'll be able to speak.
I'm here.
Oh,
Yes,
good. Nice to hear you, Mary.
Can you see me? Actually, I just asked a question, and I don't know if you want me to say
Yes,
anything
please,
as well.
if you could ask the question.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
hear you loud
Okay.
and clear.
So I'll ask my question, but also make a comment on the negotiation point and see what Comfort thinks. The question really was, when you were talking, Comfort, about, people in the rest of the world who do understand, and I've heard so many people say that from Jordan and from Africa, that Russia is the aggressor. The idea that at the same time you shouldn't take sides seems to me quite contradictory. I completely share their views about the hypocrisy of the West, and when the West is calling for Putin to be tried for the crime of aggression, I still would like to see Bush and Blair to be tried for the crime of aggression in Iraq, which really is the beginning of a lot of our troubles. So I think one can make that argument, but it seems to me that there's something strange about saying you don't then take sides. And that's what I find very difficult to understand, because how can you not take sides in this situation? And the other issue it relates to that was your exchange about negotiations. I think it's extremely difficult to have negotiations about political outcomes, because precisely for the same reason, that Russia is the aggressor and its occupation of Ukrainian territory is just unacceptable. And also it's impossible to imagine that there is a solution that's satisfactory to both sides. But on the other hand, there are actually negotiations going on, which I think are very interesting. For example, over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. And, I was just hearing that Ukraine, it's sort of stabilized because of the presence of IAEA.
Yeah, exactly.
Similarly, there was a real achievement, the agreement about exporting grain and overcoming the blockade. And there are lots of lower-level agreements on exchanges of prisoners, evacuations of civilians. So it seems to me there is an area for negotiation, but we need to draw a distinction between what one might call humanitarian negotiations and sort of top-down peace negotiations. And that probably applies also to Ethiopia. But it's a sort of general point, really.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to turn now to Mariano Aguirre. He's looking at the abandonment. So, Mariano, if we could.
Yes,
you, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you very much. Well, thank you for this event and thank you for the presentation. Do you think, Dr. Eno, that Haiti is an example of what I consider a strong trend by the big and medium powers to abandon countries that have no resources to offer and that their domestic situations at the same time seem impossible to manage? And for medium powers in this case, I would like to remember that some years ago, a series of countries in Latin America, they decided to go against some kind of taboo in Latin America, and they built up an intervention in Haiti under the UN flag, led particularly by Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. But in this moment, there are no countries at all, starting with the US and the Latin Americans and others, to be in Haiti and to implement any kind of intervention, with all the difficulties, of course, that an intervention in a country now dominated by gangs could have. But I would like to have your opinion about it. And by the way, listening to Mary Calder, I think that there is a kind of parallel in this moment with this trend against any kind of negotiations in Ukraine and against any kind of intervention in Haiti. And perhaps it's just I'm wrong, but I think that there is something similar in these two kinds of negative positions towards toward this kind of situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariano.
Yeah, those are really
Comfort.
two very good questions, and I really want to sort of acknowledge Mary's important point, talking about moments in which we have seen humanitarian negotiations, and those were hard-won. They weren't easy. Those were highly. We label them humanitarian, but they are highly political and highly sensitive. And it wasn't easy to get that Black Sea grain deal, for example. It wasn't easy to get the prisoner swaps, for example, and it required a combination of players. Turkey being one, Saudi Arabia being another. So while we label them humanitarian, they were highly political in terms of getting that going as well. So, and it goes back again to the point that you were raising. But on the issue of taking sides, I really want to emphasize again that a number of those countries who people assume haven't taken sides are very clear on the principles. They're very clear on the issue of the aggression. Let's not forget also that we saw the votes go up higher after the annexation referendum, and that was taken back to the General Assembly, and a number of countries who initially abstained back in the very first General Assembly vote in March, then voted against the annexation and made it very clear that they considered that aggression. Let's also forget that the most vocal defender of multilateralism and who spoke in defense of the UN Charter came from one of the global South countries. It was Kenya. So, you know, Kenya had taken a very
powerful speech.
Extraordinarily powerful speech. So what these countries are saying is that if you recognize these principles of sovereignty, of our political independence, we were born out of these. Don't forget that we were under colonial tutelage. So the notion that we don't believe in these things is a fallacy. But if you agree about sovereignty, if you agree about independence, then you'll also agree that it's my right as a country then to define what my foreign policy looks like as well. So I recognize and I defend Ukraine's territorial integrity, but you don't get to push me in one direction, in a direction that I find questionable as well, and that doesn't necessarily fit my imperative. But that doesn't mean that I support Russia necessarily. I'm also pragmatic. I have my reasons for now. Now, there are some countries, however you want to label them, there are some countries who have tied their lot to Russia for security reasons. We're watching very clearly what's happening in Mali, what is happening in Central African Republic, you know, where they've relied heavily on Russian mercenaries in the form of Wagner. You know, we've seen also that those countries who have got an anti-West impulse, you know, we've watched the self-interest of some of leaders who are seeking to survive and assume that Russia would somehow be an alternative security umbrella, where France, for example, hasn't been as well, and recognize those countries and the problematic positioning that they've taken vis-a-vis Ukraine. But I just want to underline that that we shouldn't ignore the reasons and the choices that countries make. You know, if the shoe was on the other foot as well, you know. You know, we were talking earlier on about the anniversary, for example, of Iraq, and there are people who generally are concerned that the same chamber that has labelled Russia an aggressor is also the chamber of other people that may also be called aggressors as well. So
This
just
is
to
the point
recognise
Mary was making as well.
On Haiti, I also completely agree. Yes, you know, Haiti is one of those unfortunate countries, and I said the irony is not lost on any one of us that, you know, Haiti, one of its legacies, the UN's most troubled country, and you know, a very bad legacy for the UN, and now having to contemplate not a UN-led, but maybe a UN-recognized, you know, foreign presence of sorts, and the fact that the region itself is holding out, and the fact that the region itself hasn't sort of given a green light to any form of foreign forces tells you about the predicament of the region as well. But also, it's a reality of just the complexities of trying to intervene to deal with criminality, banditry, and gangsterism. You know, in an urban setting, you know, what kind of forces, what kind of troops, what kind of elements can you put into that situation and hope for a good outcome? So it's a difficult conundrum, but it's the gravity also is not lost on a number of countries. But the US is not going to do that. Its checkered history means that it's not going to play that role as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the floor and here, but I do want to ask if two speakers online could come in towards the end, which was in about 7 minutes. One of them is Shelley Dean, and the other is Duff Mitchell, and see if we can go to them at the end. So I've now got to be aware that I've gone to that side, so I've got to go over to this side. So I should go to this gentleman here, please. Thank you. Please, could you not keep your hand up the whole time? Thank you, because it's very disturbing for everyone else. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your talk this evening. Commander René Belletta, Royal Navy, just working over in the office of the head of the French Navy at the moment, over from Paris. My question concerns one of the continents you haven't really spoken about, and I just wanted to know what your thoughts were. And I can't criticise your 10. You have to have 10. There are a lot out there, so you've got to keep it down to 10. The events in South America, in particular Brazil and Peru, do you see them as flash in the pans, or do you see them as embers potentially to make the 2024 list or beyond?
Great, thank you. I'll take a question at the back there, please. Thank you, in the middle.
Good evening, Adam from Holocene Impact Capital. I don't know if my question is as important as others, as I haven't raised my hand for half an hour, but out of character for myself, I'm going to be a bit optimistic. Is there a conflict you're most looking forward to or potentially seeing resolved? Let me finish. Potentially being resolved in the years ahead with a lasting resolution in that sense, looking forward to. Apologies for the phrasing on that one. Thank
That's
you.
great. And to the gentleman in white just here, to Ewan, please. You can wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm ex-UK law enforcement. I've worked in Ukraine, Liberia, Yemen, and Somalia, and I've given an endorsement on the back cover of the new edition of Damian Lewis's Operation Relentless, which covers the African Great Lakes region from the 1990s. My question is largely based on that. What basically has the UN learned about improving resilience and contingency planning? The reason I say that is I first identified Wagnerism nearly 25 years ago, and it's been in plain sight under the eyes of the UN for decades now. And it raises very serious questions about whether the organization can cope and wants to cope and is up to the job. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And then we've got 2 questions at the end, so that just means you've got to be very quick.
Yeah, okay. Flash in the pan, Brazil, Peru. You know, when we did our 10 conflicts to watch, we also did another one on sort of conflicts to sort of hope areas we hope as well. Brazil, I don't think it's I don't want to say it's a flash in the pan. It's dangerous to make a prediction game. But what we did say, also not in the 10 conflicts to watch, but in the statement that we issued this week, was it was devastating, shocking, but not a surprise, because the trend lines were already there. Bolsonaro himself did not recognize Lula's victory. His own hardline supporters themselves had been all making a lot of murmurings that they were going to sort of push back against the vote. So there was always a question about the smoothness of the transition as well. But one of the things that was never lost, and was never lost even in the years under Bolsonaro, was just the way in which key institutions, the Constitution and rule of law, and even civil society held together to protect some key principles and key institutions. So I think that's one important point as well. The other important point, and we're still looking at the polls, nobody knows what the outcome is yet, but what is beginning to emerge is that even those who did support Bolsonaro condemned the assault on the institutions as well. Some of them have come out quite vocally to say that they distance themselves from what's happened as well. And Lula's own sort of posturing as well it's not as though he wasn't aware of the possibility that there was going to be some kind of real pushback against his victory. I don't want to project already what's going to go on our 2024 list, but Peru's an interesting one, and I would put Peru in a category along with Lebanon, but also Sri Lanka and also Pakistan, of one of those countries in terms of the global ramifications of fallout from Ukraine in terms of commodities, in terms of food insecurity, and just in terms of the sheer economic impact on a number of countries as well. And I would also attach a number of countries that are now facing serious debt, a number of countries that we thought were going to be the bastions of economic growth in their regions are now suffering the knock-on effect of a hardened economic downturn as well. But again, I don't want to project what could possibly be on the list for 2024, but I think the Latin America region is one to watch, both in terms of the rise of left-wing rulers, and that's not to say that those left-wing rulers will not have or follow the same playbook as we've seen some right-leaning rulers in the region as well. I think we'll see the same.
So this is your trailer for next year's report.
Well, no, I wouldn't go that far. To answer our friend at the back, there are some countries, some regions where we do see hope. And as I said at the beginning, our methodology also includes those conflicts that we see opportunities for peacemaking, and those conflicts where we see the potential for peace, which is why Ethiopia and Yemen both appeared on our list last year and this year. If there is robust regional diplomacy, and if there's very clear intention to try to secure a truce. There are bilateral conversations taking place right now between, for example, Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in Yemen. Will that lead to a very clear intra-Yemen conversation that is necessary to happen? Can the SRSG Grunsberg help accompany that? These are all big questions, but it's one that we're watching with some hope, even though the trend lines also for war are there. And I would say the same for Ethiopia, even though that's just a very difficult one. The UN question is a good one. It's a big one. But, and yes, peacekeeping is struggling. Peacemaking is all the key institutions are struggling. And the UN is part of that, but it's also been resilient. And oftentimes we take all these crises to the UN because there's still some idea that the UN is an important multilateral agency, despite how dysfunctional parts of it is. The humanitarian agencies still play an important role, the development still play an important role. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I also recognise the question that you're asking, and it's an important one as well.
So we are over time, but I am going to go to our two speakers. So Shelley Dean can't speak, unfortunately, which, as she said, is a rarity. But she wanted to ask you about, can we identify newly discernible trends and tendencies in conflict escalation over the course of the crisis group? Maybe that's one for the future, and then I'd like to, and with connection with that, I'd like to go to Duff Mitchell, or Mitchell Duff. I'm not sure which way around that is. Excuse me if I've got that wrong. But please, if you wouldn't mind speaking and asking your question for the last one.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it's Duff Mitchell, Chatham House member, speaking to you from Canada. My question has to do with methodology for your list. With respect to conflict methodology, could the crisis group be undercounting conflicts when it focuses on individual conflicts as opposed to cluster of conflicts? For example, while individual conflicts in Nigeria may not rise to the level of other individual conflicts elsewhere, would not the fact that there are multiple security threats throughout the country, with insecurity threatening the very viability of the state, require that the country be put on a watch list? Thank you.
Thank you. And indeed, in other reports, you've mentioned the Sahel, for example, as a region. And
the one thing I would say, just in terms of methodology, is that the other thing that Crisis Group does is we have this 10 conflicts to watch, which is global.
Yeah.
In a few weeks' time, we will issue European Union global conflicts to watch, which are for the EU partners, and it goes back to a question that our friend at the back asked about lead nations, and these are ones that we think that the EU itself is in a good position to drive as well. And then we have another set of watch lists that is for the African Union, when we believe that the African Union could play a role. So this is why I say that, we have the 10 conflicts, but there are other conflicts that we're watching. In Nigeria, for me, elections this year, multiple security crises, you said it, the speaker himself said it very clearly. The fact that Nigeria is not on the list does not mean it's not of concern to us in Crisis Group, and every single year we write on Nigeria. We don't miss a beat on Nigeria. And in terms of the conflict trends, we're living through them right now. I think one of the big ones, the big mega trends that really transcend multiple borders. And here I will bring back the climate security is another one. But the other thing I would say, and I would like to live on a slightly note of optimism, is that despite all of this, and we've talked, and Bronwyn mentioned it herself yesterday about international institutions, is that one of the important things that has emerged is that, interestingly, we've all come back to multilateralism as a way out of some important crises, and despite what we may say about the UN, it's still become an important and vital centre, but other important vital centres, the G20, the G7, have become important factors because of the ascendancy of middle powers like Brazil, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia. They've become important players, and we need to keep an eye on them as well. So.
Well, Comfort, you didn't disappoint. It's a tour de force, slightly over the hour, but I think I have a sense that we could have gone on for longer with the questions, online as well as in the room. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so
for
much.
putting yourself with these 10 conflicts to watch. I think that we need to do an integration over the last 5 years, and I would love to do a bit of analysis of what you got right, what you got wrong, and what is still there that exactly. needs to keep on. But it's such an important thing to do, and that ability to be able to sort of put these 10 conflicts down and make us think is the most important thing, to make us think about what those are, the underlying trends, how we might solve them, because that's a critical component. So thank you so much for coming again. Or rather, thanks Crisis Group for coming again, and thank you for coming in your capacity now as CEO. So really brilliant. And please join me in thanking you.